Welcome to the Operator's Dilemma, where we bring you insights from the best operators in tech. My name is Chris Bergner. I'm the head of finance and analytics at Equals. And today I am joined by Kevin Kooi, who heads up finance at Mendel.ai. But we're going to take a trip in the Wayback Machine to hear about some of his time building a sales efficiency model at Intercom. But before getting into that, Kevin, just wanted to say welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here.
Right. Kevin, before we get started, I think it's always helpful to kind of just do a quick walk through your professional journey. What brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, so now I'm heading up finance and kind of HR and legal at Mendel Health, Mendel.ai. Been here, coming up on a year in a couple months. Before that, spent a year and a half at another AI ML company. I didn't say Mendel, as an AI ML kind of data abstraction tool in the medical record space, unstructured medical data. Before Mendel, I spent a year and a half at a company called Labelbox, which is a horizontal AI ML company, also kind of running finance. And before that, I was at Intercom for 5 years, building up FP&A. We're going to talk about this model, and that was my first kind of operating role. Prior to that, I had spent 5 years in consulting and a couple years at business school. But Intercom was really where I kind of sharpened my teeth and kind of built out my operating muscle for the first time.
That's helpful context. Thanks, Kevin. So take us back to when you first joined Intercom. What was this sales efficiency modeling process like? Size and scale of the company, early revs of the model that you built versus where it's at today.
Yeah, so I joined Intercom shortly after their Series C back in 2016, when the company was 30 million in revenue. Maybe 10,000-ish customers, about 200 people. And at the time, nearly all of the growth from 0 to 30 at Intercom was product-led and self-service, right? People signing up on the website via organic kind of word of mouth, kind of content marketing. So we were, to that point, largely speaking, a month-to-month self-service business. And, one of the big questions and, things we were trying to evaluate was, as we invest more on sales and going up market, trying to make sure that we had a good handle on the return of that investment, right? And how efficient was our, investing in marketing and sales dollars to a more kind of traditional sales-led selling motion relative to kind of what had got us at that point from 0 to 30. And so, at its start, it really was, hey, we've made a decision, we want to go and, invest in the sales team, but let's try to create a model so that we can, keep tabs on, trends in our efficiency and just absolute level of our efficiency in that investment and the return we're getting over time.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Can see how that would be important for tracking purposes. And we'll get into some of those like checkpoints and things that you built in a little bit later. But just kind of curious, in terms of like the applications of the model, how were you sort of thinking about like updating cadence? Were you sort of using it to do check-ins with different teams? How did you move from just the numbers portion of it to actually kind of putting it into practice and using it as a tool to interact with the business?
Good question. So it was like a quarterly update and review cadence that we incorporated into our QBRs with sales, marketing, product, to the extent it was relevant, and it evolved over time. So, early on, it was really just a overall kind of sales efficiency model where we'd look at sales versus self-serve. But as it evolved, we used it to evaluate a lot of decisions. We used it to think about different segments we wanted to invest in, small, mid-market, enterprise. We used it to evaluate kind of like pricing and packaging decisions, new product launches. And even as we thought about the downstream effects of like which segment, small, medium, large businesses, how did that impact product roadmap and sort of those decisions? So really it was quarterly. We read out to different teams as the case may be, but it influenced sort of the results, influenced a lot of downstream decisions based on what we were seeing as kind of relatively good and relatively poor areas of return in terms of like what was working versus not.
Yeah, that's something that you and I have talked a lot about, that the name can be a little bit misleading, and that this is the sales efficiency model. That's sort of the output, but the inputs are really crossing throughout the entire organization. So helpful to kind of hear how you were using that in conversations outside of strictly finance, and it was more of like company-wide strategy and measurement for that. Is that right?
Totally. No, I think it's very fair that the results are not solely held. Sales and marketing are not solely held responsible for sort of the outputs and the results of like how efficient a segment is or product. Like product is hand in hand, and how well is our product suited to a given market influences very, very heavily the return side of the equation. It's not just selling, right? It's selling and then retaining, which is in large part a product and downstream from that engineering question as well. So yeah, we called it the sales efficiency model, but it really touches basically every part of the organization.
All super helpful context, Kevin. Thanks for walking us through that. I think now would be a great time to pop open the model.
And let's start with LTV-CAC, right? So top. LTV-CAC is our overall measure of the value going to accrue to the business over the lifetime of a customer, and then dividing it by the cost to acquire that customer, right? Just your overall kind of ROI metric that you're trying to estimate. And so our steps here, and I'll go slightly out of order, is you start, how much ARR did we add in a period? Let's adjust that, because that's lifetime revenue, or that's, annualized revenue. Let's adjust that for COGS so that we get sort of a more, value kind of ending up at to Intercom. And then the big question that we spend a lot of time modeling and kind of arguing and debating is, your average lifetime for a customer and your average growth rate. And the reason why we spend a lot of time, and we've talked about this before, but a lot of times you might be newer into a segment, so you might not have years worth of data. And that impacts both sort of our average growth rate we expect in a cohort and the average amount of years you expect the customers to layer in. Once you add those metrics, you calculate your sort of implied lifetime value, sort of add it all up.
Yeah, and Kevin, just to pause on some of those assumptions there. This is really what is going to power the end results of the actual like metric output, right? Is kind of how long do you anticipate that customer is going to be there, and what sort of their growth and spend will look like over the life. Can you give some like anecdotal advice or experience on like how frequently were you reviewing these? I know you're updating the model on a quarterly basis, but how often would you revisit these assumptions, and what was like a good heuristic for how far back you would look in terms of cohort performance?
Yeah, I think, so we update the model overall on a quarterly basis, but most of that updating is just taking in the new quarter's sort of actuals in terms of spend and grow and like new customer acquisition, and sort of filling in and not tweaking things like your average lifetime or your average growth rates. However, to your point, the newer the segment, the newer, we just launched our sales motion. We just started getting more customers in the enterprise segment. We would our views on how long do we think that segment's going to stay around and how fast do we think it's going to grow, right? A lot of times you have metrics that might imply, oh, these enterprise customers are going to be around for 10 years, but you've only been selling into them for a year and a half. And so we wanted, in that case, right, Intercom, by the time I joined, had been around 5 years, been like doing some amount of sales motion for about 1. And obviously I was there for 5 years, so we had different levels of data, but our assumptions for our self-service cohort were much more stable. We had retention curves that largely hadn't changed across time, whereas our sales motion as it evolved, as we changed our upmarket product offering, changed a good amount in terms of how fast their spend would increase and what their retention was like over time. And we're not changing those every quarter, but we're certainly looking for changes in our business, and every 6 months, every year, making sure we tweak our assumptions for kind of our realized business performance, and making sure that if we think a customer is going to be around 4 years, that we look back 4 years and we have a customer from 4 years ago. And like on average, that makes about sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And obviously all the information that we're flashing on the screen in the model here is just dummy data, but meant to be representative of the methodology. I think helpful primer on the LTV side, which was sort of the long range metric that you were tracking. Tell us a little bit more about magic number.
Yeah. So, magic number is a much more near-term metric. There's very little assumptions in it. All you're doing is looking at the ARR that you added in a given quarter and dividing it by that period or the prior period's S&M spend. We always did 1 period lagged because our sales cycles were relatively quick. But depending on your sales cycles, you might lag it. But the important part is you just take ARR for a given period and you divide it by S&M for the same amount of time, whether or not it's lagged one or the other. And looking at how much you grew, right? And so, our target for that number was 0.75, right? We wanted to add at least kind of 75% of our sales and marketing dollars as ARR in a given period, sort of like a common benchmark out there. But we'd always look at this both across segments for relative performance and then across time for like how we were doing, how relative to like how we were doing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And, just based on the fact that this is a metric that's less driven on assumptions, I assume that made it easier and cleaner from a benchmarking perspective.
Yeah, I think that's, the two great things about magic number are, one, no assumptions, like very clean. There's no debate in, I think it's going to, my lifetime's going to be X versus Y. And to your other point is comparability. You can look at any kind of public company, 10K, 10Q, and get a magic number. And so I always viewed LTV to CAC as a number where you can hide assumptions and lie about your business internally, or sort of have false optimism. And magic number is a good reality check, such that if those numbers tend to diverge, particularly if you see one performing well and one performing poorly, or like moving in opposite directions in a given quarter, magic number, it forces you to ask yourself, why is that the case? And do we really believe that is the case? It certainly could be true, but it's always useful to have both in mind.
Yeah. In a perfect world, you'd have the best assumptions to inform LTV to CAC, and it would sort of tell you everything you need to know. But this can be a helpful sense check in the near term. And because it's looking at a different time horizon, it's useful to just sort of have that as a complement as well. And CAC payback is sort of this middle of the road metric that helps you with more like cash efficiency tracking, and is more of like the medium term metric. Is that right? Exactly right.
It's almost the inverse of the magic number in the calculation, where we just take the S&M spend and divide it by the ARR that you added. So if you spend $1 million and you add, or let's just use the numbers on the page, right? If we spend $500,000 in S&M spend, and we are adding, adjusting for gross margin, a little over 250K, Our CAC payback period in this case would be 2 years, roughly 24 months. This is expressed in months, right? Multiplied by 12. And, particularly in this market, right, this is an important, measure of like, when do you get that money back? When can you reinvest it? Like, certainly from a fundraising perspective, people want to see that because, compared to LTV-CAC, if, oh yeah, we have a great, 5x LTV-CAC, but it's over 25 years, and that's our assumed average lifetime. That's actually not quite as good as, an LTV-CAC at the same amount where you get paid back much quicker. There's much more surety in a shorter CAC payback period than a longer one, even for kind of same values of magic number and or LTV-CAC.
Thanks for walking us through the model there, Kevin. Super helpful to be able to see the methodology and speak through it. Maybe as a second to last question, help us think about how you sort of translated from, here's the numbers and here's sort of the science behind it, and how you are actually putting it in front of leaders to make decisions, do performance reviews, think about any strategic adjustments you needed to make, things like that.
Yeah, I think, I think I mentioned this before, we put in quarterly business reviews sort of with executives along products. I think the big, thing we always wanted to keep in mind was trying to set our targets ahead of time. So if it was a pricing and packaging change, if it's a new product launch, having clear metrics where this is part of the product launch success plan or the segment launch success plan, and make this a regular part of how product sales and marketing functions are thinking about their performance and the performance of the company overall. So that it's not just kind of a metrics dashboard in the wall that finance is looking at, but it's something that people are kind of considering when they're making their decisions. That, is the marketing $1 million takeover for this initiative, is that going to drive the revenue? And so people don't need to know all the nuts and bolts of like how it plays through the model, but they broadly conceptualize and sort of internalize, like, if I'm spending $4, I better be getting $8 back. And can I at least create a theory of the case for why I think that might happen? I think just kind of helps engender that sort of mentality across the organization.
Yeah. Were you getting a lot of questions around some of these metrics in board conversations as well?
All the time when it related to kind of, as I mentioned before, like changes or new investments, right? Early on at Intercom, right, we were not only investing in sales sort of for this first time, but as it evolved, like more in upmarket sales in particular, and having these to be able to show, is it dilutive? Is it accretive across this metric or that metric? Even if it's, our overall LTV-CAC in the self-service was like 10, sales is 5, which is worse, but still very positive and strong, and we need it from a growth perspective. It helped us construct narratives and tell stories along those lines, right? Of kind of relative and absolute efficiency, and a part of every board discussion for sure.
Yeah, that resonates quite a bit. Any other parting wisdom or advice that you'd give to folks who are maybe standing this up for the first time in their organization or in the early iterations of building?
I think it's a useful muscle to build early on. When I joined Intercom, we didn't have all the data or didn't feel confident that we had, customers going back in far enough time to like accurately assess what lifetime is. But even then, I think it's very useful to use it as a tool to kind of set a target for yourself and then measure yourself against the target and just learn. And so I think my main advice is do it early and often, and then just learn from your mistakes and like, oh, I thought we were going to be at X and we're at Y. How can we get better so that our forecast accuracy gets better over time? But very useful tool. Loved building this model and sort of monitoring it over time. And, I think it helped a lot. And, people liked kind of engaging with it across the organization, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes not.
Yeah, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. I think getting in the habit of measuring it early is important too. All right, Kevin, I think this is a good place to end it. Just wanted to say thanks again for putting the template together, for the time here on the conversation and sharing these insights with the world.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it. And yeah, anytime.
Okay. We'll maybe keep the conversation going, and folks can find you at Kevin Kooi on LinkedIn. And we will link to all the materials, blog posts, all that good stuff throughout the video and in the newsletter. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris.